The Zodiac Killer, a story of shadows. The case remains one of America's most famous unsolved murders. Northern California, in the late 1960s, lived in a curious balance between peace and turmoil. On one side were the posters promising love, music, and revolution. On the other were the quiet pockets of rural land where the world seemed untouched by time. The highways that split the region were long, dark stretches of asphalt bordered by fields, ranchland, and silence. A place where sound vanished, headlights dissolved into blackness, and the loneliness of open country settled over everything like a fine mist. It was on one of these roads, like Herman Road, that the Zodiac story truly began. Not with a letter, not with a code, not with the taunts that would soon terrify an entire state, but with two young people and a night that should have been forgettable. On December 20th, 1968, teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday drove out toward the quiet stretch between Vallejo and Benicia. They were simply looking for privacy, the sort countless couples sought on weekend nights. Lake Herman Road offered that perfectly: no passing traffic, no streetlights, only the silver wash of moonlight and the long stretches of darkness between farm fences. At around p.m., a second vehicle approached their parked rambler. Witnesses later recalled seeing an unfamiliar car in the area, but none noticed anything alarming. There were no screams, no frantic movements, just a pair of headlights that stopped behind the teenager's car before the night returned to silence. David was shot at point-blank range behind the ear. Betty Lou tried to run toward the road, but the killer fired 5 rounds into her back. She collapsed only a short distance from the car, the cold December air still moving through the grass around her. There were no signs of robbery. Nothing that suggested a crime of passion. No motive that fit anything police were familiar with. The scene was clean to clean. No usable fingerprints, no footprints that could be traced, no weapon left behind. Even the shell casings provided nothing helpful. It was as if the killer had come prepared for the silence of that road, fired his shots, and disappeared into the darkness before anyone could react. Detectives tried to make sense of the murders, leaning on familiar explanations to guide them. Was it jealousy? Had someone followed the couple? Was it a drug deal gone wrong or the work of a passing stranger? None of it fit. And yet, nothing about the crime seemed to demand more attention than any other unsolved murder. Northern California had its share of violence during those years, and the case quickly joined the long list of tragedies the newspapers reported and moved past. For 7 months, everything remained quiet. But the killer had not disappeared. He was watching, waiting, shaping something in the shadows. Then came July 4th, 1969, and with it, another attack, this time at Blue Rock Springs. And unlike the first crime, one of the victims, Michael Mageau, survived long enough to describe a man with a flashlight, a handgun, and a calm, controlled demeanor. Someone who did not run. Someone who walked away as if he had rehearsed every step. Still, the police thought it was a local gunman or a drifter. They did not realize the murders were connected. They did not foresee what was coming next. It wasn't until 3 letters, each addressed to a different newspaper, arrived that investigators finally understood they were not dealing with chance. They were not dealing with random violence. On August 1st, 1969, less than a month after the Blue Rock Springs attack, 3 California newspapers received nearly identical letters. Each bore the same slanted handwriting, the same threatening tone, and the same strange confidence. They were addressed to. Inside each envelope were details about both shootings, like Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, information that had never been made public. But even more disturbing, each letter contained 1/3 of a cipher, a block of mysterious characters arranged in a 408 symbol grid. The writer demanded that the newspapers publish them on their front pages. If they refused, he promised to kill again. There was nothing uncertain about his threat. His message opened with chilling directness. I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas. For the first time, investigators realized the two attacks were connected. What they still didn't understand was that the killer was no longer satisfied with secrecy. He wanted attention. He wanted a stage. And he had just chosen the newspapers as his audience. The Chronicle debated whether to publish the letter. Police argued that printing it might provoke more murders. Editors argued that refusing might provoke worse. In the end, the papers complied out of fear, out of duty, out of necessity. The ciphers were printed. The public began trying to solve them. The killer waited. 3 days later, the newspapers received another letter. This one began with a line that would become infamous. "This is the Zodiac speaking." It was a name chosen carefully, mysterious, powerful, symbol-driven. And with those for words, he constructed a persona larger than any criminal the region had ever seen. Reporters, detectives, and citizens alike began referring to him by the name he gave himself. It was the first victory he claimed without firing a shot, but the victory wasn't his alone. A school teacher and his wife in Salinas sat down at their kitchen table and worked through the cipher piece by piece. It took days of guessing, pattern searching, and arguing over symbols. When they cracked it, the message was grotesque. "I like killing people because it is so much fun." It rambled, it contradicted itself, it offered no identity. The final line, however, was the clearest. "I will not give you my name." By the time police confirmed the cipher's authenticity, the Zodiac had already written again. He wanted more attention. He wanted fear. He wanted conversation. On September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa, he escalated again. This time, he approached his victims Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard wearing a hood with a printed Zodiac symbol. He tied them, stabbed them repeatedly, and then calmly walked back to their car. Before leaving, he drew his symbol on their car door and listed his previous attacks like a morbid tally. Hartnell survived. Cecilia did not. And once again, the Zodiac had controlled the scene with unnerving calm. 2 weeks later, in San Francisco, he shot cab driver Paul Stein in the head. The attack seemed random, impulsive, disconnected until a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt arrived in the mail. With it came another letter, making the crime undeniable. The panic deepened. Parents kept their children home from school. Headlines dominated front pages. Detective units grew larger, but their communication grew worse. Vallejo didn't coordinate with San Francisco. Napa didn't coordinate with Vallejo. Separate jurisdictions meant separate information, and the Zodiac exploited every gap. Every new letter added pressure. Every sighting added confusion. Every clue added contradictions. And the killer watched as the world struggled to keep up with him. It was no longer about murder. It was about control. It was about the stage he created and the audience he commanded. The Zodiac had turned Northern California into his theater. I spent the next morning steeped in the Zodiac's letters. They were not the frantic scribbles of a madman. They were too deliberate for that. Each stroke of the pen felt calculated, almost theatrical, as if the killer were addressing an audience rather than a police department. I compared them side by side on my desk: ink tones, pressure points, the odd, sharp flicks at the end of his Ys and Ts small details that detectives in 1969 noted, but could never weaponize. The first cipher, cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife, lay in front of me like an old scar. It read like the ramblings of an egotistical predator who killed for fun, yet even within its grotesqueness, I saw precision. The killer was no fool. He hid behind symbols because he understood the most powerful leverage he possessed: uncertainty. Why is the Zodiac case unsolved? The answer began whispering to me from those yellowing newspaper reports. It is difficult to catch a shadow, especially one that knew how to manipulate light. Later that afternoon, I met Detective Marcus Allery, now retired, whose father had worked the case during its height. He greeted me at his modest home in Vallejo. A thin man with a worn face, Marcus had inherited his father's obsessive interest in the killer. My father believed, he began, But the Zodiac didn't simply vanish. He adapted. He leaned back, tapping the table with a finger. Every time police formed a pattern, he broke it. Every time they closed in on a direction, he turned another corner. I asked him about the suspects Arthur Lee Allen, Rick Marshall, the dozens of names that had floated through newspapers and tips. Allery sighed. He opened a box and handed me a photocopy of the Zodiac's infamous "My name is" cipher. You know what my father believed? He continued. That the cipher was never meant to be solved. He designed it to frustrate investigators. To follow it was to walk into a labyrinth. Ellery paused, and he enjoyed watching them lost. That night, in my hotel room, I replayed every detail. The letters, the symbols, the taunts, the victims. The contradictions were maddening. He was a careful, controlled killer during his first attacks, precise shot placements, quick escapes, yet later, he behaved like a man desperate for attention, sending letters, calling newspapers, threatening school buses. The shift was either deliberate misdirection or evidence of multiple personalities. Either way, the inconsistency made profiling nearly impossible. I spread crime scene photos across the table. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, Presidio Heights. 4 locations, 4 atmospheres, 4 different styles of violence. Few killers change methods so dramatically unless they are testing boundaries. They want police to believe multiple killers are at work. They are mimicking patterns intentionally to create chaos. The Zodiac fulfilled all 3. At 2:14 a.m., I returned to the Zodiac's message sent after the murder of cab driver Paul Stein. He claimed the police had caught him, but let him escape. A taunt clearly, but something in the phrasing struck me. He said they stopped him, not questioned him. The specific wording suggested a real encounter, not a fabrication. Had officers truly spoken to the killer that night? Records say they had seen a man, but dismissed him because they were given the wrong description. A simple error, a moment, a mistake that still echoes decades later. The Zodiac did not outsmart law enforcement with brilliance. He survived because humans, even the best of them, are fallible. And he knew it. The morning fog of San Francisco is a peculiar companion. It muffles sound, blurs outlines, and transforms even familiar streets into shifting silhouettes. It was in such a fog over 50 years ago that 2 patrol officers unknowingly passed the Zodiac Killer, a scene both tragic and astonishing in retrospect. I stood at the intersection of Washington and Cherry Street, the site of Paul Stein's murder. The old Victorian homes looked unchanged, as if time had merely brushed over them. It was a quiet neighborhood, elegant and complacent. Impossible to imagine that blood once stained the pavement here, or that a killer walked calmly away while sirens screamed in the distance. According to the report, officers Falk and Zelms encountered a man just blocks from the crime scene. The dispatcher had mistakenly broadcast that the suspect was a black male, though witnesses had described a white man. Because of this, the officers simply drove past him, a fatal miscommunication. A misstep that would reverberate through history. As I retraced the route, the gravity of that moment struck me. If the dispatcher had given the correct description, the Zodiac might have been arrested that night. The case might have ended before it became legend. Instead, the killer continued, both undetected and emboldened. Detective Allery had once told me, cases aren't always unsolved because of brilliance. Sometimes they're unsolved because of timing. Standing there, I finally understood what he meant. I visited the cited path, the corner where the officers saw the man, the street he walked along, the escape route he likely took. The man described was no shadowy creature, no phantom moving at supernatural speed. Just an ordinary-looking figure wearing glasses, walking with the calm of a commuter making his way home. A killer hiding in plain sight. A city looking directly at him and not knowing what it saw. Back in my temporary office, an empty room the SFED had allowed me to use, I opened a folder containing the contemporary sketches. There were inconsistencies. Even the witnesses had trouble agreeing on facial structure, hairline, and glasses shape. Human memory, though natural and honest, is an unreliable partner in the pursuit of truth. And the Zodiac understood psychology better than most criminals. He used the flaws in human perception to his advantage. The fog, the dim streetlights, the confusion. It all played in his favor. I reviewed the letter Zodiac sent days later, mocking the police for walking right past him. His tone was smug, but also revealing. He mentioned details only someone present at the scene would know. He knew which officers saw him. He confirmed that he watched them search helpless, misled, looking in the wrong direction. He reveled in the near capture. He wore survival like a badge. Why didn't the case progress after that? Why didn't the police lock onto a definitive suspect? The more I studied the timeline, the more I realized the killer didn't vanish, he simply blended. Suspects emerged, some compelling, some absurd. But each carried enough inconsistencies to remain inconclusive. Arthur Lee Allen, perhaps the most infamous suspect, matched several behavioral patterns: violent past, interest in codes, and proximity to crime scenes. Yet handwriting didn't match. DNA, what little there was, didn't match. His appearance differed significantly from the sketches. Rick Marshall had the intellect, but lacked the motive. Lawrence Kane fit the description, but lacked concrete TIs. Hundreds of lesser-known suspects carried pieces of the Zodiac's puzzle, but none completed the portrait. The closer investigators came, the more the Zodiac evaporated. Not because he was untouchable, but because every lead fractured into doubt. The fog of San Francisco had long lifted by the time I left the intersection, yet the metaphor remained. The Zodiac case was not a single path obscured by weather. It was a maze engineered by a man who thrived on ambiguity. A killer who never needed to outrun justice, only to confuse it. By the time I reached the headquarters of the San Francisco Chronicle archives, I had already gone through dozens of documents and witness statements. Yet nothing prepared me for the feeling of holding the Zodiac ciphers in my hands, not the originals, of course, but perfect reproductions. Code sheets, symbols, strange clusters of shapes that looked both childish and sinister at once. They were not merely puzzles. They were declarations of dominance. The Zodiac didn't kill just to kill, he killed to be noticed, to be feared, to be studied. And nothing demonstrates that better than the ciphers he mailed to newspapers, demanding publication under threats of further violence. I spread the ciphers out on the table, studying the intricate lines and symbols. The first one, famously solved by schoolteacher Donald Hardin and his wife, revealed the chilling message: I like killing people because ID is so much fun, crude, disturbing, and devoid of remorse. It was the closest thing to a confession the killer ever gave, wrapped in a puzzle he expected the world to struggle with. But the later ciphers, especially the 340 cipher, became sources of obsession and frustration for decades. I leaned over it, scanning the encoded rows. For half a century, it resisted decoding. Thousands tried. Expert cryptologists, intelligence agencies, amateurs, computer programs, everyone took their shot at unmasking the killer's words. And then, miraculously, in 2020, a trio of codebreakers finally cracked it. I read the decrypted message aloud to myself. There was no identity hidden within it, no final revelation. Instead, it was another taunt, a denial of fear, a boast about evading capture. He mocked the notion that he would be caught. A man who tells the world he's uncatchable is either delusional or terrifyingly confident. The Zodiac was the latter. Detective Ellery once said, criminals want power, but real monsters want an audience, and that was the Zodiac's defining trait: he needed spectators. Every letter, every call to police, every symbol was crafted to ensure he remained center stage. Why pour effort into ciphers? Why communicate with newspapers? Why break silence only to mock investigators? Because his identity wasn't merely his face or his name. His identity was the fear he generated. Still, one cannot ignore the possibility that the ciphers hold deeper personal meaning. Cryptologists noted repeated patterns that suggested inside jokes or distorted fragments of personal truth. Some speculated the symbols were inspired by military codes, others believed they were self-invented. A few even linked them to ancient runes or astrological symbols, though such theories often leaned toward sensationalism rather than evidence. As I took notes, I realized a strange paradox. The more one studied the ciphers, the less they revealed about the man. The killer designed them to be solvable yet empty, readable yet meaningless. A message without a message. What made the Zodiac crazy, what made the case maddening, was that he never followed the rules of motive or pattern. Profilers attempted to sketch his psyche. Likely a white male, mid-20s to mid-40s, intelligent, but socially isolated, possibly ex-military, perhaps living in the Bay Area. But such profiles apply to thousands of men. Some argued he was a pathological narcissist. Others believed he was a sadist seeking fame. A few suspected mental illness. But no profile ever led to a concrete identification. I ran my hand across the cipher pages again. So many symbols. So many theories. And none of them helped reveal the man behind the mask. That was the essence of the Zodiac Killer, someone who mastered the art of telling the world everything while simultaneously revealing nothing. Just then, a Chronicle archivist stepped inside and handed me a thin folder. Inside it were reader letters submitted at the time ordinary people who believed they had solved the ciphers or identified the killer. Their words were full of certainty, speculation, and fear. Everyone thought they had seen the Zodiac's face somewhere. A neighbor, a coworker, a stranger on a bus. The killer had turned an entire city into unwilling detectives. And that, perhaps, was his greatest crime. There is a particular heaviness that settles over a case when you reach its end and realize there is no ending at all, only fractures, possibilities, and shadows. As I packed away the documents in the Chronicle archives, I felt it clearly. The Zodiac Killer case was not simply unsolved. It was designed to remain unsolved. To conclude my research, I visited the last place connected to the Zodiac's confirmed timeline, the area around Presidio Heights, where people claimed to have seen him disappear into the park after murdering Paul Stein. Today, it is peaceful, a wide expanse of trees, jogging paths, and picnic areas. But in 1969, it was a labyrinth of darkness. Officers searched for hours, flashlights slicing through constellations of leaves, but found nothing. Nothing except silence. Nothing except the absence of a man who shouldn't have been able to vanish. Why did he escape? Why did the case fall apart? The more I investigated, the more I realized the truth was not hidden in a single mistake, but in a chain of circumstances, each one weak enough to break the investigation just as it gained momentum. Miscommunication, darkness, fear, human error, an ambitious killer who understood all of these better than the police did. The Zodiac case is unsolved not because investigators were incompetent, but because the killer existed in the space between certainty and doubt. Every clue was real, but every clue was also flawed. Every suspect was compelling, but every suspect was also incomplete. The perfect storm of an unsolvable case. As I sat inside the park's empty clearing, I listed the reasons this case still haunts the world. 1. The killer chose random victims. Most serial killers target specific types of people. The Zodiac did not. His victims were couples in cars, teenagers at a lake, a cab driver in a city. No pattern meant no predictive method. 2. He communicated just enough to torment. His letters dominated headlines. He fed the public fear and starved investigators of useful information. 3. His ciphers were designed to distract people, spent decades decoding meaningless bravado while the killer's real identity remained untouched. 4. No confirmed DNA exists. What evidence remains is contaminated, partial, or degraded. 5. Reliable eyewitnesses were few, and those few contradicted each other. 6. He simply stopped or appeared to. This is the strangest part. Did he die? Move? Get imprisoned for another crime? Lose interest? Or is it possible that some later murders were his, but never recognized? The killer's silence became his greatest disguise. 7. He wanted to become a myth, and myths are harder to catch than men. As I wrote my final notes, I recognized that the Zodiac didn't just kill people, he killed certainty. He killed the idea that evidence always leads somewhere. He killed the assumption that law enforcement always gets answers in the end. A final piece of the puzzle emerged when I revisited the 2002 and 2018 attempts to pull DNA from the stamps and envelopes. Despite modern technology, the samples produced nothing conclusive. It was as if the killer had left the world with one last message: "You will never know me." I stood and looked across the Presidio, the sun now setting behind rows of quiet trees. The city moved on decades ago, but the story hadn't. It lives in documentaries, books, online forums, and sleepless nights of amateur sleuths who still believe they can solve a puzzle that devoured experts. Why does this case stay alive? Because the Zodiac is not a person anymore, he is a question. A fear. A reminder of how thin the line is between understanding and confusion. The final truth of the Zodiac Killer is that he crafted his own legend, piece by piece, letter by letter, crime by crime. Not because he wanted to disappear, but because he wanted to be everywhere in headlines, in theories, in nightmares, and in the very fabric of American mystery. He succeeded, and that is why the case remains unsolved. Not due to lack of effort, but because the killer wrote a story the world has never stopped reading.